Good morning. So we all know that change is painful and growth is painful. But I think nothing is more painful than being stagnant and stuck where you are. I'm Joyce Vargas. I'm a program manager and Agile Scrum Master at Atlassian. And I'd like to invite you on a journey of embracing change. So whether you're new to Agile or you're a seasoned expert, we're going to start at the very beginning. So it's February 2001, back in Snowbird, Utah. And the 17 people gathered to talk and ski and relax and to try to find common ground. And they all came from the world of software development, and they had one thing in common. They were all deeply dissatisfied by the way the world built software. They felt strongly that software development was a very heavyweight process. It was largely driven by documentation and really didn't have any concern for the people or the humans that were actually building the software. And they all wanted to figure out a better way. And these men were innovators. They were involved in developing what was known as lightweight methods at the time, which was a budding field in software development. So Ken Schwaber and Jeff Sutherland, they created a lightweight method called Scrum in 1995. And Kent Beck created Extreme Programming, another lightweight method, or XP, the following year. And there were representatives from other methods as well. And a lot like what we're doing today, they came together to share their ideas. And they liked the idea of writing some sort of document to capture the common ground that they were discovering together, and to act sort of as a rallying cry to the software industry. The problem was no one really liked the term lightweight. They felt it missed the point. It wasn't really the point of these new methods they were creating. It was really just a symptom. And so finally they agreed to call it Agile because they thought it captured the adaptiveness and the response to change that they thought was so important to the new approaches that they were developing. So at the end of their 2-day gathering, they published a document, and they called it the Manifesto for Agile Software Development. And they all signed it. And this was their call to arms, their statement of their beliefs. And it described what they stood for, what they were opposed to. And the document said, we are uncovering better ways of developing software by doing it and by helping others do it. And through this work, we have come to value individuals and interactions over processes and tools, working software over comprehensive documentation, customer collaboration over contract negotiation, and responding to change over following a plan. And they said while they value all of these things, they valued the items on the top in blue over the ones in red. And then they also came up with 12 principles behind the manifesto. And these had to do with customer satisfaction, welcoming changing requirements, even late in development, delivering software frequently, working together, and building projects around motivated individuals, and that it was really important to convey information via face-to-face conversation. They emphasized that working software is the primary measure of progress, and they promoted sustainable development, so maintaining a constant pace of work indefinitely. They said it was important to give continuous attention to technical excellence, and that simplicity is essential as well. And they said that good teams are empowered and are self-organized, and that teams should reflect and tune their behavior regularly as well. So after 2 days, they all left Snowbird, and they left with different expectations. So one of the men, Martin Fowler, he said, I just hope that greater communication would lead to something interesting. I didn't expect much at that meeting. And of course, here we are today, 18 years later, and the rest is history, because we know that Agile is now a household term in the world of software development. And we're all familiar with Agile practices like sprints and user stories, stand-ups, Kanban, story pointing. And it really seems sometimes that Agile is defined by all this stuff, all these practices. and many people do get very focused and caught up in them. But notice that the original manifesto authors, they never mentioned anything about stand-ups and sprints. And this is because the heart of Agile, it's much more than a set of practices that you do. You can't do Agile, you really become Agile. It's this state of being. And this is a sentiment that's becoming more and more apparent in recent years. So a recent Forbes article stated that Agile as a concept is finally coming of age as a philosophy and a way of thinking, in lieu of being seen as a mere project management methodology. So Agile seems to go way beyond software development. We know now it's a term that came from the manifesto, and we know that it's this way of thinking, this philosophy. But what exactly is this core idea behind this Agile philosophy, this way of thinking? This way of thinking is empiricism. So empiricism is the theory that all knowledge is derived from experience. So in an empirical environment, you make decisions based on observation rather than things like planning or feelings. For example, pilots are taught empiricism. So when they are flying a plane and they see a storm up ahead, they observe that, they don't stick with their original plan. They will, of course, course correct and change their plan based on the observation of the environment around them. And empiricism is the foundation of Scrum, the most commonly practiced Agile framework. So Scrum has these three pillars: transparency, inspect, and adapt. So transparency is all about presenting the facts as is. And inspection can be done on your product, processes, people, and improvements. And then adaptation is all about adopting change based on the results of your inspection. And Scrum is designed around these three pillars. So for example, it prescribes events like the daily Scrum, where we're transparent with one another on a daily basis. We inspect what we did yesterday, today, any impediments, and then we adapt our plan accordingly every single day. And the same goes for other Scrum events, as well as things like adapting to customer feedback and changing business needs. Extreme programming also aligns with empiricism, with its core tenet being to embrace change. So if customer requirements have changed dramatically, a team will acknowledge them and welcome them, and they plan a new course of action during their next iteration planning. But this idea of empiricism, it didn't start with the manifesto authors. Actually, throughout history, we see a similar storyline played out, where different people in different eras, they put empiricism into practice. And like the manifesto authors, all of these people sought a better way of working. So let's walk through this. Back in the 1600s, Bacon and Galileo, they thought there was a better way to understand the world around them. And among others, they played a key role in developing the scientific method. So as you might know from high school, the scientific method involves making a hypothesis, conducting an experiment, observing your results, and then deriving a conclusion based on your observation. So it's an empirical method. And these men redefined how modern science was practiced to this day. Now fast forward to 1950. William Deming was an American engineer, professor, and consultant. And he went to Japan in 1950, and he started teaching his philosophy on quality and productivity. And he was actually largely unknown in America until later in his life. But in Japan, he was a big deal. He was the patron saint of quality control. He was widely credited with the Japanese industrial resurgence after World War II. So much so that the most coveted industrial award in Japan is known as the Deming Prize, and it's still awarded and highly esteemed today. So Deming is known for creating the Deming wheel, which is a way of working where you plan, do, study, and act. So it's the PDSA cycle. And this is sometimes also known as plan, do, check, act, so PDCA. And it's a quality control model that's based on empiricism. So you'll notice that the PDCA cycle, it closely resembles our modern software development cycle. And that's because Agile frameworks like Scrum, they are a PDCA cycle, essentially. We plan our dev work, we do it or implement it, and then we check, we test and validate it, and then we take action to continuously improve with every iteration. Now let's fast forward to 1970. So a man named Winston Royce, he published this paper called Managing the Development of Large Software Systems. And he was also exploring, very similarly, how software development could be improved. And in his paper, he had this diagram, and it described a linear approach to software development. You might be familiar with this. The diagram, it looks like a waterfall, where progress flows in one sequential direction, and work moves through these distinct phases. So a lot of people mistakenly credit Royce as the inventor of waterfall, even though others had described it before him. He wasn't the first one. And interestingly, he only included this diagram because he wanted to communicate that it was a flawed model. So he wrote about waterfall critically. He said, the implementation is risky and invites failure. And in my experience, this simpler method has never worked on large software development efforts. So you might know waterfall can introduce knowledge silos with handoffs, a lack of shared responsibilities and accountability, and it can often lead to missed or rushed deadlines, going over budget, high risk, things like that. So ironically, Royce was an early Agilist. His paper talked about principles not unlike those in the manifesto. So he proposed working iteratively, prototyping, involving the customer. Nevertheless, I guess people didn't really pay attention to what he wrote. The visual is what stuck. And waterfall became the predominant way that people built software for a long time. And in many ways, the principles from waterfall are still ingrained in the way that we work today. Okay, now we'll fast forward to the 1980s. So Kaoru Ishikawa, he was a Japanese organizational theorist and professor. And he spent his life trying to make people think differently about the way they work, much like many of these people we've been exploring. So he's known for inventing this fishbone cause and effect diagram, where it's used to determine the root causes of quality problems. So consistent with empiricism, his model focused on making problems transparent, so you can inspect, you can identify changes needed to then improve or adapt upon them. And he is considered the father of Japanese quality control, and he was largely influenced by Deming and the PDCA cycle. And around the same time, a man named Taiichi Ohno, he was also working to change the way manufacturing worked. So previously, the primary method of manufacturing was the assembly line. And this was a process that resembled waterfall, where you have work that moves from station to station sequentially. And the assembly line is great for producing something known at great volume. But for auto manufacturing, which is very complex, where there are many parts where things could go wrong, Ohno found that the assembly line process didn't work well. So he was working at Toyota. He started as a shop floor supervisor, and he eventually became an executive. And while he was at Toyota, he developed the Toyota Production System, or TPS. And much like Ishikawa, he focused on making problems visible, so improvements could be made. And his whole philosophy was around eliminating waste to achieve the best possible efficiency. He invented this concept of just-in-time, which is to make only what's needed when needed at every stage of production. And thanks to Ohno's innovations, Toyota became the leading auto manufacturer in the world. And American auto manufacturers began to study TPS, and it became known to the Western world as lean manufacturing. TPS is also where Kanban originated. So the characters kan and ban, they mean look and board, or signboard or billboard. And so the whole purpose of a Kanban board is to visualize your system of work, to make it transparent. And our work is then pulled into each phase of work in a just-in-time manner. So of course, we commonly use Kanban boards in our development workflows today. And again, it's a way to make our work visible, to surface problems and blockers at the moment that they occur. And then we use other Agile practices like limiting your work in progress, which originated from that concept of just in time, where you're working only on what's needed, when needed, at every stage of development. So it was this rich history and context that heavily influenced and led up to the Agile Manifesto. And the manifesto authors were very familiar with all those that came before them. So all of these people were linked by this common thread. They were agents of change in their status quo, and they understood and they deeply valued empiricism. So the manifesto authors, they took these ideas from lean and empirical thinking, and they brought it into the world of software development. And they changed the culture around them drastically. So we've kind of explored the origins of Agile. We know that it came from the manifesto. We know that it's this way of thinking and that it has this rich historical context. But what does Agile mean today? I think Ahmed Sidki described it best, actually at last year's Agile camp in this room. So he is a well-known Agile thought leader, and he said, Agile is a growth mindset. It's a way of working grounded in a culture of learning. So this means when you are in an Agile environment, when I learn something, I'm able to incorporate it. Because incorporating learning, that is empiricism. So Sidki said that Agile is a mindset described by 4 values. Those are the values in the Agile Manifesto. It's defined by 12 principles. Those are the 12 principles behind the manifesto. And then Agile is manifested through an unlimited number of practices. So these practices, you can think of them like tools in a toolbox. So you can use any number of them in combination, and that's a good thing. Sidki says once you limit the number of practices that you use, you limit your agility. So again, we often focus too heavily on just the practices themselves, the doing part. But it's important to remember that the practices, they are just tools. They are not the end goal. They're really a means of carrying out the Agile mindset and values and principles to embody that Agile state of being or that way of thinking. So now what does Agile look like in practice? So let me tell you about one of my own teams. I have a background in user experience, and not too long ago I worked at Trello as a designer. And we were a fully remote team, but we met every year one time in person. So this is us last winter in New York. So this team is made up of product, engineering, design, and QA. And we went on an Agile journey. So not too long ago, we were plagued with many pain points in the way that we worked. And maybe you can relate to some of these. We did a lot of Agile things, like sprints and committing to a goal. But we never actually delivered on our commitments. Our work dragged on sprint to sprint for weeks and months. We used t-shirt sizes to estimate our work, but they were never really accurate. They seemed pointless. There wasn't a way to reliably predict when work could get done. And so this made collaborating with our stakeholders very difficult. We also often found out mid-sprint that work wasn't really truly ready for development. There were still a lot of open questions and dependencies to resolve, complexity. And so this meant that mid-sprint we had stalled work or we had to do some rework. Also, our work often came out of development near the end of a sprint. And so our tester was then confronted with this mountain of work to get through in a very short amount of time. Our meetings also weren't valuable. They felt inefficient. We did things like grooming and planning, but there wasn't much distinction between them. Discussions were not always relevant to everyone. So in theory, we were a team, but in practice, really, we were a group of highly talented individuals working very independently on different things and not truly collaborating. And we felt disconnected from each other and our work, especially as a remote team. And this impacted our morale. And so we decided to try and adopt Agile values and principles and to leverage that toolbox of different practices and to strive to use them as designed. And we decided to try this for 2 months to prove it out and to evaluate if it would work for us. So this is what we did. First, we adopted Scrum. And I like to describe Scrum as an Agile framework of 2-3-3-5. So together as a team, we crafted 2 definitions, a definition of ready and a definition of done. And this gave us a shared understanding of when work was truly ready for development, and then when work was considered done in a sprint. And then we selected 3 new roles based on what Scrum prescribes. So I was a designer, but design work was really light, and so I took on a Scrum Master role. And I was responsible for coaching everyone to uphold the Scrum framework and values, and to serve the team by removing impediments. And then we selected a product owner that was accountable for business value, and they were empowered to guide the team. And then finally, we had a self-organizing development team that was accountable to one another, and that was encouraged to function as a unit as opposed to independently. We also adopted the 3 Scrum artifacts. So that's the product backlog, which was a prioritized list of all the work to do. And then a sprint backlog, which contains all the work that we plan to do for each sprint. And then a working increment of software that was potentially shippable. So this was the value that we aimed to deliver at the end of every sprint. And then we also revamped and improved our 5 Scrum ceremonies. These were sprint planning, daily Scrum, the sprint, sprint review, and sprint retrospective. So this is what our whole development cycle looked like, and it gave us a very robust framework for planning and checking our work. So this is a PDCA cycle. But Scrum, it doesn't actually prescribe how you execute on your work, what to do during the sprint itself. And so we went to our toolbox and we leveraged other Agile practices in combination with Scrum. Because remember, Agile is manifested through an unlimited number of practices. And these are tools to help us carry out the Agile values and principles. So here are some of the additional practices that we adopted. And I'll dive into more detail about how this all played out. So first, one principle that we focused on was to radiate information. And this is all about fostering transparency, that first pillar of Scrum. Because only when you have the transparency, then can you then inspect and adapt. So we radiated information through our team Kanban board. And our old board looks something like this. You may have a similar one in your team. And this did a decent job of visualizing the development workflow. But design and anything that came before this was a black hole. And so we revamped our board and we added columns to map out the pre-development workflow. And this made design visible. It helped to expose blockers that arose in earlier phases. And then remember those 2 definitions that we crafted, definition of ready, definition of done. Again, we radiated the information. We made it visible by posting it on a team dashboard for anyone to reference. And then we also included it directly in our user stories. So we were always looking at it. And the team was empowered to revisit these definitions, and we tweaked them as needed. We also started tracking velocity. So this showed us how much work we could accomplish per sprint. It was a measure of capacity, not performance. And again, we made it visible by posting it in a central place. And we brought it up, we looked at it together, every sprint planning and every retro, to build this shared context and to help inform our discussions. So now our sprint commitments were based on real historical data, and they were much more viable. We also started using a burn down chart, which showed us how much work we were completing or burning through each day. And again, we made it visible. So we pulled it up at every stand-up and looked at it together. And it encouraged us to make incremental progress, to actually deliver stories by day 1 of each sprint and throughout the sprint, rather than having a lot of work in progress built up at the end of a sprint. And then in addition to the actual work, we also fostered transparency around team health. So every sprint, I sent out a simple, quick Google survey asking people to rate their happiness. So this was anonymous, but again, we radiated the information, we shared the results, and we pulled it up at the beginning of every retro to help frame our discussion. So if there were any threes, we knew clearly that we had things to discuss and things to improve upon. We were transparent with each other in that way. And then we also pushed to increase our frequency of communication. So for a team to work well together, really they need to talk to each other a lot. If you remember, one of the principles behind the Agile Manifesto is that the most efficient and effective method of conveying information to and within a dev team is face-to-face conversation. But we were a fully remote team, so we were never face-to-face. And so for us, this meant that we needed more meetings. And I know that more meetings, it doesn't always sound like an improvement, because we all know we've had those meetings where you meet to schedule another meeting. There's even this book, Death by Meeting. But for us, we realized what we needed was not fewer meetings. That was not the root problem. What we needed really was meetings that had more value. And so we revisited each Scrum event according to its original purpose. And we did things like creating a focused agenda and making it visible via screen share on our remote calls. And this gave everyone a shared context and expectation in our face-to-face discussions. And then anyone was empowered to call out if we were going off track. Also, if we had shorter meetings, we would schedule them back-to-back to avoid dead time between meetings and to give the team longer chunks of heads-down work time. And we found through doing this that our meetings were more focused and efficient and often ended early. And everyone was more engaged with the extra face time, and we felt more like a team. And I should also note that one other thing we did besides these Scrum event meetings, where we had just a weekly hangout, where for 30 minutes we would get together and not talk about work on a video call. We would just socialize, and this helped us a lot as well in feeling more engaged and more like a team. We also adopted a daily Scrum, which is essentially a stand-up, but we made improvements according to the original intent. So we kept it strictly time-boxed to 15 minutes, and then we focused our 3 questions around the sprint goal versus general updates, which we were doing before. So before we were kind of just saying, what did I do yesterday? What did I do today? Any blockers? And often things weren't relevant to each other, and so people kind of tune out. So instead, we said, what did I do yesterday that helped the team meet the sprint goal? What will I do today to help the team meet the sprint goal? And do I see any impediment that would prevent me or the team from meeting the sprint goal? So we really focused heavily around the sprint and the value that we were trying to deliver. And unlike before, where this could drag on for 40 minutes, this became a daily huddle like it was supposed to be. So it allowed for collaboration, asking for help, adapting our plan, and mitigating risks on a daily basis. And it often took us no more than 5 minutes. One thing to note is that with your increased frequency of communication, it's important to keep your team or your meeting size small, because as the number of people increase, the lines of communication become increasingly complex. You can see in that diagram, there's many lines very quickly. And so we aim to involve people in meetings that were only directly involved in the work at hand. Jeff Bezos has this 2-pizza rule, where you should be able to feed everyone in your meeting with no more than 2 pizzas. If you need more pizzas, then you have too many people. And so with a smaller group, we found that we were more focused and that we could make decisions faster. We also followed the lean manufacturing principle of working in small units, small batches of work. So we adopted user stories, and we aimed to keep the scope of each one very small. So we had this template user story card in Trello. It had a very simple format that was easily repeatable. And then as part of our backlog refinement sessions, we wrote acceptance criteria using a behavior-driven development format. So these are all tools, and each of these really can be a workshop in and of itself. So I don't have time to go through all of them, but I definitely encourage you, if it looks interesting, to look into them and learn more about them. And so we embedded our definition of ready as a checklist in our user stories. So this meant that we don't allow work to go into a sprint if it's too unclear. It has to first meet this agreed upon definition of ready. And so then at the point of development, that means all our questions are answered, work is ready to be picked up immediately, and we avoid that stalled work or that rework. We also adopted tasking, which blended well with our definition of done. And so we also embedded that directly in our user story. And it gave us this clear indication of progress throughout the sprint. And it also gave everyone a shared understanding of collective work that had to be done. So in the past, when we were working in these larger batches, our sprint board looked something like this. Our system of work didn't have any flow. We had many dependencies. We had these batches of piled up work that were stalled or blocked. And so quality overall was compromised. And we couldn't deliver value at that sustainable pace because we were so often impeded and blocked. On the flip side, when we focused on working on these in small, manageable units, each piece of work had less complexity and risk and less dependency. And so we could work in flow. And so work started to move through our system of work at a sustainable pace with great efficiency. And we were able to complete stories and deliver that value incrementally, even by the first day of a sprint, instead of having a bottleneck at the end. We also completely changed the way that we estimated our work. So we adopted Agile estimation techniques. So Agile estimation is based on relative values instead of absolute. So for example, it's much easier for me to estimate the amount of water in this glass with relative values than absolute. So I can say, I estimate that the water in this glass, the volume of water in this glass is large relative to this one, which is medium, relative to that one, which is small. And I would be fairly accurate with that estimate. But if I tried to estimate in absolute values of ounces, for example, that would be a lot harder and much more likely to be inaccurate. So taking this, the same idea, the same principles, we moved away from time-based estimates because those are based on absolute values of hours and days and weeks. And instead, we adopted relative parameters of effort, risk, complexity, and uncertainty. And we now had much more confidence and much more accuracy in our estimates. We adopted story pointing based on the Fibonacci sequence, which is a relative scale found in nature. And then we used planning poker to conduct our estimation sessions. And this helped us to remove cognitive bias because with planning poker, everyone has to make their estimate at the same time. So you can't be influenced by what someone else says. And then this is really key. We used to estimate by individual. So a developer would estimate for dev effort, a QA would estimate for testing effort. But we changed that, and we now estimate for collective effort. So each individual not only estimates their own work, but everyone else's as well. And this is because it's really just a more accurate reflection of reality, because it takes everyone's effort to get work through a sprint and to get it done in a sprint. We found that this also fostered empathy across the team because team members had to take into account other people's work, and they had to start to learn what other people needed to do and what their workloads looked like. Also, instead of just estimating at one point in time, we made course estimates at early stages and then refined estimates at later stages. So the course estimates, they were made at a point of high uncertainty. So they're very rough, mainly just for planning and prioritization. And then we revisited it later when the work was better defined. So this goes back to empiricism. We were adapting our estimate based on new learnings, based on observation. We also would estimate in priority order. And so we would estimate highest value items first so that we could ensure that we were delivering value. So very much like the authors of the manifesto, our team sought to improve the way that we work. And we formed a culture of continuous improvement. We ultimately found a lot of value in Agile, and so we decided to continue with it. And of course, we were not perfect, but we made huge strides. And unlike before, we started to consistently finish most of our sprints. And we were able to deliver real customer value faster instead of carrying work across weeks and months. And this gave us a great sense of accomplishment and progress. So Agile concepts are easy to understand, but they're difficult to master. But teams that diligently seek to embody Agile values can expect great benefits. So you can expect to deliver faster, with increased value, and at higher quality. Agile turns development upside down. It allows increased flexibility in the actual work done. So with waterfall, your scope is fixed, but your time and budget are flexible. And this often means that things can take longer or they can cost more. But with Agile, it's completely flipped. Your time or your sprint time box is completely fixed. Your budget is fixed, but your scope is completely flexible. And so you can adjust your scope as needs change. And so you can focus on delivering value. And this aligns with that original principle of welcoming changing requirements and embracing that. Agile is designed for complexity and uncertainty. So this is a Stacy matrix. It depicts a model for understanding complexity. So if work is largely known and we only need to execute on it, then waterfall works really well in this realm of simplicity, much like the assembly line. But if we have a lot of unknowns, then we need to try things and we need to iterate. And Agile is designed for this. It lives in this area of complexity and uncertainty where we can employ empiricism. And then there's chaos, where you have maximum uncertainty in your technology and scope, and nothing really works here. Agile also smooths out the productivity curve. So with waterfall, your pattern of work looks more like the gray line with the peaks and valleys. So you'll have big pushes. You might have a big release. You might be working overtime, nights and weekends, and then you get that out the door, and then things slow down. You have a lull, and your pattern kind of repeats like that. But with Agile, we have a much more steady and predictable pace of productivity. One of the principles was to have this constant pace of continuous delivery. And so your work pattern looks more like this dark, wavy line. And as teams get used to this rhythm, they get better and better at collaborating. And we avoid things like over-specialization and burning out. Agile also reduces risk. So with waterfall, your issues or risks, they're not surfaced in the early requirements gathering phase. So they're typically not found until later in development when the project is completed and delivered, so when it's often too late. But with Agile, again, because we are promoting this steady pace of value creation, of frequent delivery, risks are found and mitigated and resolved frequently at every point of delivery. Agile also advocates for small and dedicated teams. So with waterfall, you have specialized disciplines that hand off their work. And so you have one discipline that is idle and the other is engaged. And the idle folks are waiting around, and so they'll start to work on other things. And you end up with people doing a lot of context switching, juggling different projects. And this chart shows the time lost as the number of projects or your context switching increases. But with Agile, we aim to remove this waste of lost time by advocating for team members that are 100% dedicated and collaborating every step of the way. Agile embraces T-shaped skills. So this doesn't mean that you're a jack of all trades and a master of none. What it means is that you have skills that are deep in one area, but wide across others. Because remember, Agile is a growth mindset. So it means that you're not limited by what your job title says that you do. And this is why I could be a designer. That was the skill I had deep in one area. But I could also do Scrum work. I could also help out with testing, things like that. So teams with these T-shaped skills, they can be much more cross-functional, and their roles start to overlap, so they can start to support each other and be much more efficient. So continuous improvement is better than delayed perfection, and this is what Agile is all about. We will never arrive at a state of perfection in the way that we work, but Agile gives us a mindset to improve continuously. And as we work better, our products improve and our customers benefit. And creating value continues to lead to more value. Thank you so much for your time today. There's only so much I can cover in 50 minutes, so I invite you to keep in touch. Please come chat with me afterwards or connect online. I'd love to keep the conversation going. And I think we have a bit of time for questions. And then if you could also fill out the survey on your way out, that would be great. So any questions?